Okay, so we are Revolutions in Latin America. Hopefully you know us by now. This is Matt, Kristen, and I'm Liz. Please know us by now. So essentially we assessed Cuba, Colombia, Paraguay, and Honduras. But we actually found sort of a unique case where we didn't really believe that any of them qualified as like fully revolutionary situations. There were some that we deemed more likely, like Cuba, for example. But there's not a strong, clear ideology nor a unified movement in any of these countries, probably due to all the corruption and high levels of government and the lack of responsiveness to civilian concerns.
And the fact that all throughout Latin America, drug cartels are a common thread, which create, big issues with mobilizing revolutionary force.
Just to spread us out.
Okay. So Honduras structurally meets a lot of the conditions that make a likely revolution. It's an exclusive state. A lot of parties technically compete in the elections, the largest ones being the left-wing Libre Party and the current National Conservative Party. The only problem is the state actually targets members of the Libre Party and sends them to jail for offenses that didn't occur. There's a lot of voter fraud. The president wins elections by 98%, even though the people hate him. There's a lot of corruption in terms of voting officials. The government responded to complaints of voter fraud by putting family members of the president as monitors for the elections, which, as you might predict, didn't work out so well. There's a general societal anarchy which prevents people from feeling safe. They feel physically and psychologically threatened all the time. They feel like their government pretty much doesn't exist. A most recent poll said that more than 58% of the population felt like they didn't have a state. And the state is also highly patrimonial, with high levels of corruption that exceed just general voter fraud. They typically have to do with the police. Drug cartels are rampant in Honduras, and the police accept bribes from the government to cover it up and from the drug cartels to basically let them run free. There are only 9 members of the homicide department, even though 97% of homicides, which are generally drug-related, go unsolved. There are more than 20 murders a day in Honduras, so people feel like this corruption in the police is even more of a personal offense because it affects the people so personally. The central government is very weak. They basically bow to whatever the cartels want. Youth gangs called Maras, control the rest of the crime that isn't related to drug cartels. More than 71% of the population lives in poverty, which makes a big social problem for the government. They have very little infrastructure as far as welfare programs, nothing like food stamps. People go hungry frequently in Honduras, and the lack of social infrastructure is something they complain about frequently. As far as economic unstable equilibrium, high rates of poverty are only where the problem starts. People don't have any kind of investment in their own economy because foreign companies own almost 3/4 of the economy. They have the banana and coffee industries, which is where most of the people who do have jobs in Honduras work. They work for extremely low wages, and they don't get any kind of advancement. They feel like their prospects are pretty much cut off. The elite are not extremely alienated because the officials tend to benefit from the kind of bribes that come from the cartels. The elite are generally pretty happy. There are very few of them, and they pretty much just stick close to the government. The high homicide rates, like I talked about in Honduras, those are the kind of things that the kind of popular anger is based off of, but there isn't as much of a clear ideology. It's more of a general unrest. People have become considerably frustrated with the fact that no one can seem to change the situation in Honduras. They feel like their children don't have any prospects. Something that has been garnering international attention is that they've been sending their children as immigrants to America, which then became a subject of American attention. So international support might favor revolution just because of how it's been brought to our attention that the gangs and the drugs in Honduras are making children so desperate that they do really crazy things to try and get out. As far as the revolutionary situation, there is no coalition for control because the only networked people in Honduras are the gangs and the drug cartels. Gangs are pitted against each other. So you have like 4 or 5 different networks of gangs, and then you have the larger drug cartel networks. So the only people who are really left to protest are typically poor women who don't really have any resources, don't have access to the kind of things that you need to create a revolution. And people who do protest, when they're protesting homicide rates, gangs take that as an offense, and the next day those people will be dead in the streets, which is a general incentive against revolution. So while the state is very weak, what you could call kind of semi-state forces, what's really running the country, are very strong, oppressive gangs. There isn't a whole lot of sustained public opposition because, like I said, all the cartels have to do is come in with a couple guns and threats, and a street protest disappears immediately. Widespread poverty, like I said, more than 70% of the population live in poverty. This means, you're thinking sustenance first, not getting shot first. Those kind of concerns prevent people from taking to the streets a lot, and discourage a successful revolution, even though people are very unhappy with their regime.
Okay, so our next country was Paraguay, and this was a somewhat exclusive state. It's had a conservative party, the Colorado Group, which stayed in power for almost 60 years before briefly losing power in 2008. It took back power last year, and President Cortez has vastly ramped up military expenditures, executive powers, and judicial influence. So in that sense, the citizens have nominal control over the government, but not very little in practice. In terms of patrimonial, the Paraguayan government is relatively corrupt due to, again, the narcotics trade and rebel guerrilla forces. The largest one, the EPP, has a lot of drug influence, and they have killed a lot of people. They've attacked journalists, human rights activists, and just anybody who speaks out against them, really. And partly as a result of that, the government is generally weak. It's not able to address violence, the drug crime, and the violence related to it, or poverty, which is extremely widespread. For unstable equilibrium, there's a lot of popular anger over both the regime and the guerrilla injustices, partially because so much of that is tied together with elites taking bribes. The police decide not to prosecute anything, and again, individual human rights are not very emphasized. There is nominal freedom of speech and press, but in practice it doesn't last very long. There's a large wealth gap between the elites that are tied to the drug money and the rest of the population. And in terms of international focus, both the US and other countries who are receiving drug problems, they've put more focus on the border security and other efforts to curtail the drug trade. And then in terms of elite alienation, there really isn't that much, because most of the government officials benefit either through bribes or other forms of money laundering from the drug trade. So in their view, even though it's a weak state, they don't mind because they're profiting. And then in terms of an active revolutionary situation, we again found that there wasn't much of one. There's a democratic opposition that would mostly center on the ex-president who was removed from office in 2013. It's mostly a center-left coalition, and in that sense, one possible ideology would be Marxism, but it hasn't found too much popular support. There are protests, but they don't usually last all that long because people are generally too poor to be able to stay out in the streets for sustained periods of time against the regime. And that said, the regime is not that able to crack down because they lack control compared to the guerrilla forces. So between the police and the paramilitary groups that the drug gangs fund, there's a lot of crackdown on individual dissent.
And as far as Colombia, we found that while it was more revolutionary than Honduras, it was generally lacking a revolutionary situation. It does meet a lot of structural conditions because it's fairly exclusive, and the government has worked to kind of gain a little more popular support as opposed to the general unrest about government corruption, which is really obvious in Colombia. But instead of really achieving any transparency, they just kind of tooted their own horn whenever they did something good and covered it up when they showed any signs of corruption. So this kind of push didn't work at all. It is a patrimonial state, but the fact that it's a relatively strong regime prevents a lot of opposition to the patrimonialism, cartel power, and lots of discontent about the extent of the cartels and about the exclusivity of the state have kind of petered out a little bit, but awakened more in recent years, especially with agrarian type protests. Labor unions and farmers have really composed the bulk of this. While Colombians have nominal constitutional rights, the law really doesn't apply to what the police choose to do. They technically have freedom to assembly and freedom to protest, but whenever they take to the streets, the police have no qualms using lethal force. They get shot down pretty much in firing squads, which prevents them from street protests. There is general unstable equilibrium because of the guerrilla group FARC. They tend to have a left-wing ideology, but it gets a little fuzzy frequently because it is a pretty fragmented group. As with many guerrilla armies, they call themselves the People's Army, but the people are really upset with the human rights abuses that happen under FARC and under the police. The police crack down on any protests, which are generally protesting police brutality. A little bit of irony, but the agrarian strikes recently, especially the ones in April of this year, tended to make news. But they were at the border, composed of mostly labor unions, farmers, and peasantry, but they were mowed down by the military and by police forces. And this got a little bit of international attention, but it prevented the people from ever striking again since then. So since the spring, we haven't really seen a lot of unrest, just because people are tending to keep it to themselves out of fear. There is a unified ideology against the government forming, but it has less to do with labor unions because they know that they need a wider base of support. So the typical banner has been broken promises, that the government hasn't followed through on the promises that it made to push for more transparency in response to corruption complaints, and also the promises that it made to labor unions before the elections, and the promises that it made to farmers as far as social services and pulling them out of poverty. So really the common thread here is that people are able to tie the guerrilla forces to the government and blame the kind of things that these left-wing fragmented armies do, which are typically very brutal and violent, tie them to the government, blame it on the fact that the government has been corrupt and that, of course, somebody was going to rise against them. So the ability to blame FARC's issues on the government has been crucial in kind of mobilizing people under this wing of broken promises. The only revolutionary situation we can see in Colombia would be the sustained opposition to these guerrilla forces. However, people are typically a lot more timid, most recently in the past few months, to go out of their homes to voice opposition because there has been systematic targeting of activists and of common people, farmers, laborers that have been part of revolutions. The security forces tend to not know where to put their allegiance because sometimes the left-wing guerrilla forces have the power, sometimes the government has the power, sometimes the protesters seem to be building a power. So the police tend to do their own kind of oppression, which is kind of separate from the government's oppression, which is more of like a systematic finding out who opposes the government, who we know are activists, and sending in the military to oust them. The police tend to say, take the protests in the streets and cut them off, prevent people from barricading roads, and open fire on them, whereas the left-wing guerrilla forces tend to find a lot of civilian casualties while they're fighting the government. So there tends to be a security force issue there.
Okay, so I'm fairly certain that we're running out of time, but let's just go over Cuba really fast because it was the one we identified as the most likely to have revolution. So essentially there's been one-party rule for a number of years. As I'm sure you know, the United States has imposed an embargo on Cuba. So this Communist Party rule has created a lot of tensions, both internationally and domestically. So it's an exclusive state, fairly patrimonial. There's a lot of corruption, especially considering so many businesses are state-owned and the narcotics industry plays such a significant role in the economy. So it's really difficult to separate the Cuban economy from the narcotics trade. So widespread poverty remains and has been fairly consistent over the past 50, 60 years. And it's very difficult for the regime to actually provide capable, useful public resources and public goods. So it's not a state that's conducive to the needs of the impoverished. So essentially, the embargo has created significant economic turmoil. There's very minimal elite alienation, but intense bureaucracy, intense military control. So it's difficult to find fractures in that system in order for a revolutionary group to actually take charge. But there is popular anger over poverty, significant discontent, especially in the younger generation, over lack of freedom, about how people were nominally guaranteed certain rights, but then not effectively guaranteed those same rights. There's also been a significant contingent that's focused on liberalism, mirroring the United States, the system that we have, and mirroring successful revolutions in other Latin American countries. So there's definitely been a push against this one-party rule in recent years. It's also particularly important to note that international actors, most notably the US, have definitely favored transitioning to a liberal democracy. So essentially, the regime is very oppressive. There's not currently a strong coalition that's really seeking to gain control, but an ideology of liberalism is definitely forming, particularly amongst people our age. There's not currently significant public commitment, nor do many people take to the streets to protest, considering widespread fear. But there's hope that lots of political scientists of the region have reported that potentially in the next 10 to 15 years, there could be more people focused on ensuring liberal democracy as opposed to this one-party rule. So that moves us on to sort of the big picture takeaway. We deemed Cuba most vulnerable and Honduras least vulnerable, but it's important to note this sort of caveat. When assessing these, we found that there wasn't a significant unified ideology that had formed that in any of these Latin American countries that really made it so that we felt like a democratic revolution was particularly likely. That being said, there's different degrees of vulnerability. It just has to do most significantly with how strong the narcotics trade is in the region, and there's this sort of widespread fear and panic, especially considering if you take to the streets, you never know what's going to happen. Will there be police retribution, or will there be gang violence and retribution that way? So it's difficult for people to really feel compelled to actually revolt.
And a few interesting characteristics that we found common among Latin America is that revolutions that have succeeded historically tended to mobilize young men especially, and the reason we think that this is not as much of a revolutionary situation in these nations is that young men tend to join maras or street gangs around the age of 14. So before they can even protest or feel alienated, feel like they don't have a lot of prospect, the people who kind of come along and say, hey, this isn't right, if you want a way out, are not people who are seeking a new government. They're people who use violence and get out of the cycle of poverty with the drug trade. Another interesting dynamic is the fact that Cuba, were it to have a revolution, would be a more liberal revolution led by young people, whereas in Honduras we saw that the kind of social anarchy prevalent there, the things that people were calling for were a stronger government, were a government that could control the cartels and the gangs, which would be more of an authoritarian role, which is something we haven't seen in a while. So
on that note, thank you very much.